I'm Jacob Heilbrunn, the editor of the National Interest, and it is my great pleasure today to welcome two speakers for a searching examination, perhaps even a titanic clash of the relations between the United States and China and where they're headed. Our first speaker will be my longstanding friend, Bridge Colby, who is a principal at the Marathon Initiative and also the author of a new book called Strategy of Denial. Bridge has attained a great deal of prominence for his contention that we should be looking more at Asia. In essence, I think he's calling for an Asia first policy rather than expending so much effort on Europe. Our second speaker is Paul Heer, formerly affiliated with the Center for the National Interest, now a senior fellow at the Chicago Council of Foreign Relations. He is also the author of a book on Mr. X and Asia, and he is a gifted writer and lucid thinker. And I'm delighted to kick off our conversation with these two authors and foreign policy experts by asking them, in the wake of the balloon incident, which acquired so much prominence in recent weeks, are the United States and China inevitably headed towards some kind of clash, or can it be warded off? Can we establish a more mutually beneficial relationship? Bridge, I'd like to start with you.
Well, thank you, my friend. Great to be with you, Jacob, and with Paul as well, two great minds. So look forward to the discussion. I'll try to be brief. I think rivalry and to some degree confrontation is inevitable. And in fact, it's already there. And I think that's basically driven by structure and the sort of incommensurate goals that the United States and China have. China being a classic, rising power with expanding ambitions and sense of its own, what it's entitled to. I do not believe that war is inevitable. I agree. I think Eli Ratner put it very well in response to a question from Senator Rubio the other day in testimony, which is that, we can get out of this decade without a war. My view is that the way to do so is from a position of strength. That's sort of a cheesy kind of cliche, but I think there's truth in it. My view, as we've discussed before, Jacob, in this context, is that that we need to be hawkish, if you will, to get to a place where we can be more dovish. So I think a country like China, it could be, I was having a conversation with some Chinese experts a while ago about my book, and they said, it could be, you could describe the way you're talking about us as country C and you as country A. And I think that's right. It's human nature and its structural incentives. As China grows, it's going to see what it can get away with. And there's going to be increasing, for those of us who were in Washington during the Iraq War, we're familiar with the sense of a country that feels like it's at rising power, apogee of its power. It's likely to be tempted to use it. And so the important thing is to array, if you will, I don't want to suggest a kind of sort of specificity or delicacy, but kind of array the incentives and disincentives to China in such a way that it will negotiate the terms of its continued rise on terms that are reasonable and equitable to us. So in a sense, the goal actually is détente, in my view. But to get to détente, we have to be in a position where China has to respect our fundamental equities. I think if we try détente now, if you will, that we are likely to get taken advantage of and other countries are likely to defect. And I was just reviewing Paul's, I thought, very thoughtful and incisive discussion, kind of pivoting off of my book that involves some critiques. And I hope we can get into some of these kind of more fundamental issues. I mean, my view is not that, we should not take China seriously as a culture or anything to the contrary, but I think, international politics tends towards the Darwinian at some level. Animals practice it as well, strategy and so forth. So I think that's the sort of model that we want. And I think, as we've discussed before, Jacob, my goal is not the revolution within. I mean, I for the Chinese people's sake, I would wish a revolution away from communist government, but I don't think we need the dismemberment or regime change in China. What we need is a China that respects others, due claims and equities, and then China will be, in that world, will be one of the two world superpowers that will command respect. It will effectively have probably a kind of sphere of influence, even if we don't formally recognize it. So I think that's a reasonable goal. But as my friend Matt Pottinger sometimes puts it, we have to sprint to qualify for the marathon. And I think that's the trouble where we are now.
Paul, sprint to qualify for the marathon. Is that what we need to do?
I wouldn't disagree with that. Actually, I concur with much of what Bridge just said. I think that rivalry is inevitable, that it is structural, but I also agree that conflict is not inevitable. I think where I might diverge is I think that I think Bridge said we need to be hawkish before we can be dovish. I think we need to be both at the same time. I fully agree that we need to bolster our defense capabilities with regard to, I mean, we can come back to the Taiwan issue and across the board. But I think that can't be to the exclusion of diplomacy. And in fact, I think that's one of the tragic consequences, if maybe tragic is too strong a word, of this balloon episode. I think there was at least an attempt to get into some momentum of restoring reciprocal engagement with the Chinese, and I think that the balloon episode really revealed the strategic mistrust and the hostility on both sides, or the inherent disinclination to be attentive to each other's respective interests. And in that regard, I mean, I agree with Bridge that our goal here should be to reach a point where China is able to accept peaceful coexistence with the United States, although he didn't use that term. I think it does apply, in which the Chinese respect our fundamental interests. But I don't think we can escape an element of that equation that involves the U.S. paying more attention to what the Chinese perceive as their fundamental interests. I mean, and there's different elements of that, how you want to define core interest and where the Taiwan issue fits into it. But I suppose maybe that's the main point, I think, on where we diverge, is whether the hawkish approach is the only one we should pursue. I'm a big fan of engagement. I think that's a necessary element of this equation. I think that we're in a bad place in the relationship right now because the balloon episode has exposed the reasons why there's really a resistance on both sides to pursue that. There's not enough mutual trust to do that. But I'll leave it at that for now.
Let me, and I should want to tell the audience, all our viewers, that I am more than happy to pose your questions to our panelists. If you just submit them, I will ask them. Let me cut to the nitty-gritty, gentlemen. Right now, there's a lot of talk about China assisting Russia. The Biden administration has publicly warned China not to send military equipment, not to raid its own arsenal, to aid Russia in its war of conquest against Ukraine. Now, Bridge, how does that fit with your thesis that we're expending too much effort on Ukraine and not enough on China? Are we in fact seeing an alliance between the two developing?
Effectively, I mean, it's an alliance in the sort of pre-1914 use of the term. I mean, they're clearly allied in the way that Britain and France were probably in 1913 or something. So just on that point, people often say, well, that means you need to fight them in Europe in order to defeat them in Asia. That actually is not true. Actually, the fact that they're actually actively collaborating only accentuates the importance of focusing on Asia, because it means that they can act collaboratively to try to distract us, which I think is highly possible. I mean, I don't know, but it would not surprise me if the Chinese are deliberately, inculcating that or encouraging that dynamic. I mean, I'm just struck, and I was saying this the last couple of days. I mean, Secretary Blinken's warning of serious consequences should they provide lethal support. And by the way, they've been essentially propping up the Russian economy and providing other forms of military support. I mean, my basic read is that there's almost no way, and I'm influenced by people like Yun Sun and others who know more about this, but it just stands to reason structurally. Russia's China's only major power ally, and they're not going to let that ship go under. Now, Russia being weakened has some forms of advantage for them in the sense it becomes a more pliant sort of junior partner, as my partner Wes Mitchell would say, a sidecar. And at the same time, it's a useful distraction, especially as the war seems likely to become protracted, sadly. And the United States is sort of doubling down. But I was struck just on to your question, Jacob, about how there's serious consequences, but Wang Yi refused to rule out the use of force against Taiwan. And they flew a balloon over our country, and that didn't have serious consequences? I mean, I think to be fair, where I'm thinking, I think there are elements within the administration that are trying to focus on China, and I applaud their efforts. There have been big things on the force posture issues. There have been the semiconductor sanctions and other things that are being worked. Those are very important. But it's clear to me that the political level, as a fundamental orientation, I think the president himself, I mean, he said he has a part of his heart is in Kiev. He said it's a fundamental contest between democracy and autocracy. So this is the big problem, is that we're saying that China is the priority, but we're not actually following through on it.
But Bridge, let me follow up just to bore in here a little. If we were to fail to stand by Kiev in its war to retain its sovereignty, you don't think that would send a signal to China that it's game on?
I mean, we're realists here, right? This is the Center for the National Interest. I don't think normative sort of kind of mimicry is how international politics works. I think the Chinese, and this gets to the fundamental issues that Paul and I were talking about actually before we get on in his review. I mean, how states make calculations. And these are somewhat theoretical, but they're very practical. My view is China's ultimate decision on Taiwan is going to be primarily driven by its political, Xi Jinping's own political calculus, the behavior on Taiwan, the sort of anti-hegemonic coalition, and particularly the regional military balance. How the United States behaves vis-a-vis Ukraine is a data point, but I would say like a tertiary one. I mean, and that has to be weighed against the more significant issue, which is how does this deplete not only U.S. weapon stores, but political capital and willingness to expend money and other things just in a generic political sense, vis-a-vis a potential contest in Asia. I mean, just to be able to put a fine point on it, I mean, the logic that you have to fight China in Ukraine is the same logic that the defenders of the war in Vietnam applied to the contest in Europe. And I just don't think that's true. I'm not in favor of cutting off support to the Ukrainians. I do believe we should support the Ukrainians, consistent with a genuine prioritization of China. And the critical thing that we have to bear in mind is that we are not yet on the right trajectory in a good place. There's a good article in the Washington Post, I think it's Ellen Nakashima, where she quotes Admiral Aquilino, an interested party, yes, but pretty sober in his public commentary, saying we need more of a sense of urgency to deter war. So we're sort of pocketing. There's a broader dynamic here, which is that we're pocketing gains as if we've solved problems just because we've recognized them. Like the defense industrial base, there's a lot of sort of sense, hey, everybody realizes we need to spend more and fix our defense industrial base. Okay, that's like saying, well, we have a smoking problem, but we haven't actually kicked the smoking problem yet. And we're acting as if we've kicked the smoking problem. And that's a huge problem. And the dangerous thing, Jacob, is that the war appears likely to go on. There's even David Sanger was reporting today that the Russians may indeed, I mean, their offensive so far in Ukraine has thankfully been unimpressive, but that they may do further mobilization. They are digging deep. He gave a huge speech, pulled out a new start. He's not giving up. I mean, anything's possible, but I don't think that's a prudent assessment. And so we really are confronted by the problem of choice. And I think our stated strategy is correct. China and Asia should be our priority. We should act like it.
Paul, I want to follow up with you on this and your previous statement that you didn't think that a hawkish posture towards China would be beneficial. Do you in fact think that it would boomerang on the US in places like Ukraine, prompting China to take a tougher line against the US? Is that where you're headed?
Well, I mean, we got at least three different sets of issues we're grappling with here. One is the prospects for the war in Ukraine. Two is what its implications are for the Taiwan issue, and three, what Beijing's posture with regard to the war is. I think I would say a couple of things on the second issue. I mean, I'm not an expert on what's going on the ground in Ukraine, but in terms of, I mean, your question is framed in terms of how Beijing is interpreting the U.S. posture and how it should respond to that. I think, with regard to Taiwan, I think the Chinese, I think their assessment on both of these issues is continuing to evolve. With regard to Taiwan, I think that the Chinese certainly appreciate the fact, the extent to which we're preoccupied in Europe. I agree with Bridge on that. And I think they'll probably appreciate the extent to which we're depleting our resources and weaponry there that might not be applicable to Taiwan. On the other hand, I think the Chinese have to be somewhat chastened by the fighting spirit of the Ukrainians, which they can expect to see, I think, on the people of Taiwan if they move in that direction. I think the Chinese are also frustrated that the Ukraine thing, because of the comparisons that have been made, is increasing attention to the Taiwan issue, if only for the wrong reasons, because there's so many differences there. So I think on balance, the Chinese are marginally more cautious about their planning with regard to Taiwan because of what's happening in Ukraine. But I think, the bottom line for me is that the Chinese are not going to use what's happening in Ukraine as an opportunity to seize an opportunity to move against Taiwan. And we can come back to this. I think it's because the Chinese are not looking for an opportunity to use force against Taiwan. That's a separate issue. On the broader issue of, the great power confrontation there, which is inherent in all the commentary we've seen over the last couple of days about the reports that the Chinese might be considering delivery of lethal aid to the Russians. I haven't seen the intelligence there. I'm not sure. I think it's interesting that what we know is that they're considering it. The Chinese have been trying to walk a line and not successfully for the last year. Claiming neutrality and claiming that they're still committed to peaceful or to sovereignty and territorial integrity, even though the Russians, their friends, are violating that in Ukraine, while at the same time maintaining their relationship with Russia. There have been limits to that support in spite of their no limits commitment, because Elbridge said there's obviously an economic support base there. The Chinese have tried to avoid explicitly violating the sanctions, and to date they have not provided decisive military aid. My bottom line is that the Chinese don't want to own this problem. They don't want World War III. I don't think the Chinese believe that they can provide lethal aid to the extent that it would make the difference. I can't see them calculating that. They don't want Russia to lose, but I think that, I think they calculate that it's not necessarily within their power to prevent that from happening. That's why what we're seeing this week is this simultaneous reporting on how they might increase support to Russia. But what's apparently about to come out now, Xi Jinping is going to really apparently make some speech with a peace plan or a proposal for a ceasefire. I link those two things together, and it seems to me that the Chinese, whatever they're considering in terms of increasing their aid to the Russians, I think is more likely aimed at bolstering that support for the purpose of trying to hasten an end to the conflict. I think that, there's some arguments that the Chinese enjoy the benefits of this war that they wanted to drag on. I don't subscribe to that. I think they would like it to end, but they're grappling with how to, because it would relieve them of a lot of dilemmas if this was over in some way. But I think they're still grappling with how to achieve that. So I think they're focused more on this peace proposal than they are on providing substantial lethal aid. It might happen, but I'd be surprised that if they cross that line.
Bridge, the portrait that Paul has just drawn strikes me as more of a status quo than a revisionist power.
Right.
Isn't it the case that if we, and you may violently disagree with Paul when he said that China is not looking for an opportunity right now to roll over Taiwan, isn't it the case that Russia is in fact the revisionist, the more volatile, the more unpredictable power of the two, whereas China is perhaps, if Paul is correct, looking more for a rapprochement or some kind of stability with the West? What's your take?
Well, you put your finger on it. And again, I think this gets back to sort of fundamental theoretical assessments. I really resist attempts to kind of essentialize states' behavior, that they are revisionist or not revisionist. I think that largely is due to structure and relatively contingent factors. And, 20 years ago, Putin was a status quo actor. Now he's a revisionist actor. Under Mao, China was the ultimate revisionist actor. Now it's a status quo actor. We cannot assume that that's fixed. I have debates about this with my good friend Dale Copeland at the University of Virginia, who would be a really good participant in one of these sessions. So, I mean, I think the problem here is that China's, and I really want to zero in on what Paul said, because I think this is the nature of the, I actually agree with Paul that China is not looking for an opportunity to use military force against Taiwan. My fear is, my concern is that their goals, their express goals, but also what they are structurally, naturally looking to attain, which is great power hegemony over their region, basically, is only attainable by military force. And they will work out that logic. Taiwan is not going to fall into their lap. It's not, in my view. And the only way to get there is military force. And they will come to that conclusion sooner or later. My view is they probably already have. I don't think there's any reason to think that we are smarter than they are, probably to the contrary. So I think that and this is sort of, this is, I think, a fundamental, and I mean, I think, you know, Paul, this is kind of the right debate to have. And Paul, I don't want to kind of put you in a box, but I would say it's kind of like, my approach is sort of deductive and structural. And I think there's the other approach, the emphasis is based more frankly on dealing with the China. I mean, I have experience with the Chinese over the years, but nothing like Paul's. He knows it much better than I do. But where do you put that weight on in terms of sort of continuity based on, you know, the history that we know it, or what we expect the cost and the sort of rationalistic cost and benefit, or sort of calculus. And mine is really the latter, especially when we think about matters of war and peace. And if we look historically, countries can radically change their orientation, their behavior. And this is especially important because China has immense incentives to generate as much surprise as possible. Surprise is not quite the right term, but it's sort of to act in ways that do not trigger or accelerate countervailing actions. And so I don't take any comfort in the fact that they are not advertising, although, I mean, frankly, they kind of are. I mean, Wang Yi actually didn't rule out military force, which would have been easy for him to do. I mean, I know that's their position, but like he obviously was at the Munich Security Conference. He could have been a little flexible. So, but I think the way Paul is talking about in terms of this weighing of the costs and benefits, I have a somewhat different assessment of the nature of Chinese decision-making right now. Xi Jinping strikes me as more aggressive. What they say publicly, I tend to discount more than what they are probably doing privately than he does. But I think the fundamental problem is that they are unlikely to achieve their goals peacefully in the world. And they're going to essentially come to a decision about whether or not they want to pursue those goals militarily or not. And if there is an advantageous way to do so, I think they're much more likely to do so. And by the way, I don't think the Taiwanese, we can rely on the Taiwanese to fight like the Ukrainians, unfortunately. But Taiwan is important nonetheless. Even if the Taiwanese are all hippies and, you know, flashing peace signs, it's still important to American interests. And that's the problem. And what I fear is that we're teeing up this situation by focusing on Ukraine, where Taiwan will receive an unfavorable comparison to Ukraine, perhaps justified, but missing the point, which is that Taiwan is important anyway. And if you're in the Philippines or in Hanoi or ASEAN, even our allies like in South Korea and Japan, you're going to wonder yourself, well, Japan is not a very martial culture either these days. You know, they're getting around to it, sort of, but this is not 1942. So, you know, that logic takes you in a dangerous place from the position of maintaining and developing what I think of as this anti-hegemonic coalition.
Paul, I'd like to give you the chance for a brief response before I turn to some of the questions from the audience.
Sure. Yes. Actually, that does get to some of the fault lines here. I mean, I think I agree. Well, there's a whole basket of issues here as well. I agree with Bridge that the Chinese are trying to pursue what we would call regional hegemony within East Asia. We could talk separately about their pursuit of global hegemony, which I think is an overstatement. But I think that depends. And I think Bridge addressed this in his book. There's different ways to define hegemony, preeminence, whatever. I mean, sometimes those terms are interchangeable. But actually, the other thought occurred to me listening to Bridge just now, that there is I'm a historian. I think he's more of a political scientist. So that's the way I kind of approach things, I guess. The point I would make about Chinese pursuit of hegemony, I would make 2 points. I don't think, again, depending on how we define this, that their vision for hegemony is necessarily hostile to or exclusive of the United States and its interests. I think secondly, and perhaps more importantly, based on what Bridge said, I don't think the Chinese calculate that military power is the primary or the exclusive vehicle for achieving it. In fact, I think the Chinese believe that their hegemony, both regional and to whatever extent of influence they're trying to extend globally, will be based primarily on their economic power. And I think that's the way that they're pursuing it in the region. I'll leave it at that for now.
So we have a question from Jeffrey Kemp, who has been affiliated with the Center for the National Interest for decades. And he says that Australia and Japan and South Korea are fully capable of developing nuclear weapons. Should the United States review its policy toward non-proliferation in light of the China threat? Bridge, why don't you begin?
Well, the way I think about it, and I actually wrote a piece in the National Interest about this almost 10 years ago, that geopolitics should trump non-proliferation. Obviously, we have a strong and valid interest in non-proliferation, but the fundamental purpose of American foreign policy is to deny, one of the world's key regions, especially Asia now, given that it's the concentration of global wealth and productivity, any country to dominate that. And if it's necessary, or if it's, we get into a situation in which there is proliferation to our allies, that should be subordinated logically to the maintenance of our, geopolitical interests. I would say the alligator closest to the boat is the North Korea situation, where, their development of ICBMs basically outpacing our missile defense systems effectively presents a really difficult dilemma that cannot simply be solved by reassurance. And I mean, there's the sort of reflexive reassurance, but the problem is that what happens on the peninsula, divorced from China, is not important enough to risk American cities. So we either have to be able to deny their ability to hit us with ICBMs, or there will be, I think, an inexorable pressure towards friendly proliferation to South Korea, presumably, but also potentially Japan. And of course, China as well. Here's what I'd say, and I talked about this in my book at the end. Friendly proliferation is not a panacea. I mean, in this way, I look at it. I mean, Jim Schlesinger wrote something really interesting in the late 60s about this. That's sort of the era where people last sort of seriously grappled with this. I mean, small, vulnerable, not very accurate arsenals in the hands of allies are not going to be a huge factor, because China's not going to want to march into Tokyo Bay. China may seize the Ryukyus in 10 or 15 years as a negotiating leverage. And if Australia, this is my objection to Hugh White's argument, if Australia gets nuclear weapons and they use it against China, A, it's not clear they'd get through, because China might first strike them and have its own missile defenses, and B, then it will destroy Australia. I mean, I have no doubt that the Chinese would have the resolve to do that. So any kind of friendly proliferation would have to be integrated within the American-led alliance structure. Where I think this is going to reach a real head with China is I think what China is pursuing is a combination of conventional dominance and a nuclear force that's able to fight under the nuclear shadow, limited nuclear war under the sort of strategic shadow, under MAD, kind of stability and stability paradox. And that's what they're doing with their nuclear buildup. They're increasing numbers, but they're also developing more discriminate, accurate, militarily usable capabilities. But their main goal, it seems to me, and this is just inferential based on what they're doing, is conventional dominance. If we lose conventional dominance, I do not believe that U.S. first use in defense, certainly of Taiwan, at scale is going to be credible or frankly rational. So a demonstration shot is not going to deter the Chinese, and in the event of a war, it's not going to stop them. So you'd have to use nuclear weapons at scale, but of course the Chinese are going to be able to hit the American homeland in very large numbers. And so I just don't think that, unlike in the Cold War, initially we had nuclear monopoly / decisive superiority that degraded into a kind of, without going into it, a different posture over the later part of the Cold War. I don't think we can go back there. So either we retain conventional dominance, or we will very likely have to face friendly proliferation.
Paul.
Well, Bridge knows a lot more about nuclear weapons and nuclear doctrine than I do. But as a historian, my simple answer would be more nuclear powers is probably not a good thing. And I think that, there's been speculation or contemplation of this over many years that we should, that one of our sources of leverage with the Chinese is the possibility that we would allow the Japanese or the Koreans or the Australians to become nuclear powers. I'm not sure that that's a persuasive lever against the Chinese when they recognize the reasons we ourselves didn't have historically not wanted that to happen.
Well, we have a question for Bridge from Ethan Kessler at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. And he asks, would Bridge argue that there would be fewer trade-offs between backing Ukraine and preparing Taiwan if the US limited the number of HIMARS and GMLRS it sent to Kyiv? Ethan doesn't think that weaponry is necessarily critical for a Taiwan contingency. What's your take, Bridge?
Sure, thanks. No, I mean, I think the most kind of manifested element of the trade-off is the particular weapons. I mean, what I would say on that is that weapons that are being sent to Ukraine are usable by the Taiwanese. I mean, one of the myths about a conflict over Taiwan is that it would not be a ground war. It would definitely be a ground war. In fact, the CSIS report, War Game report, which I have some problems with, but its number one finding was the importance of the Taiwanese ground forces. So, obviously we can talk about different kinds of capabilities, range, et cetera. But I mean, I think, and by the way, the Taiwanese are getting pushed back years. This was reported today. I can't remember where, but that they're years behind on delivery, and that's partially the Taiwanese fault, partially ours. The deeper problem is, again, and this gets at like the smoking habit issue, is like the defense industrial base is in sorry shape for structural reasons going back to the 90s and the peace dividend and yada, yada, yada. That's where it is. And it's actually Dave Norquist, the former acting Secretary of Defense, pointed out in testimony, I think last week, the situation is actually continuing to deteriorate. So just because we've recognized the problem doesn't mean it's better. We have another CSIS report by Seth Jones pointed out, we have one factory that produces turbofans for cruise missiles. Well, that's like, and so subcomponents and chains, I mean, these are assembled in hundreds, maybe sometimes thousands, different places in various ways. So this is a real problem. And I think it's becoming clear that there is a real trade-off in terms of the capabilities. And again, the bottom line is and Taiwan is not where it needs to be. So that like, we're massively overweight and we're about to have a heart attack. And then we're saying, we're going to do this other thing and we're going to walk and chew gum at the same time. Doesn't work.
Good question from Stanley Chow for both of you. I'll start with Paul and then go to Bridge. He says the US seems to be stoking or provoking China to act on Taiwan with Nancy Pelosi's visit. Now we have Kevin McCarthy, who's talking about visiting Taiwan. He asks, is the United States starting to backtrack on its one China policy? What's the end result of all these actions? Paul?
Well, that's a very good question. My answer is that we need to confront the inconsistencies and the credibility of our affirmations of our one China policy. I mean, that's what I would add to the military deterrent part of the equation on the Taiwan issue. I agree with Bridge, and he's written extensively about this, what we need to be doing to help bolster Taiwan's self-defense capability. But I think that there has to be a reassurance element to the deterrence equation. The Chinese are not looking for an excuse to attack Taiwan. They're looking for reasons not to, and they're quite insistent and clear on what they're looking for. They're looking for credible reassurances of our one China policy. In fact, Jessica Chen Weiss just published an article, I think, in the Washington Post overnight, which addressed this. I think there needs to be more persuasive reassurances that U.S. policy is not aimed at permanent separation. Because I think the idea that we do not support independence is not sufficient, frankly, because the Taiwan polity already claims to enjoy independence. So I think Stanley's question is the right one, is an appropriate one to ask, because I think we focus inordinately on the reasons that the Chinese are eager to use force against Taiwan without paying attention to the reactive component of that approach. And I think there are actions that are being taken and statements that have been made in the U.S.-Taiwan relationship, which upgrade that relationship in ways which raise, I think, valid questions on the Chinese side about what the nature of our one China policy is. And I think that in addition to this focus on the military deterrent equation, we need to confront that part of the equation as well.
Yeah, I mean, if I think actually Paul's kind of put something we agree on is a lot of the sort of Kissingerian sort of arrangements that on both proliferation to some extent, but also on the Taiwan issue that were satisfactory in an era defined by a dramatically unequal power balance and the inability of the Chinese to do anything about it and so forth, are no longer satisfactory. I mean, we can't. I don't think we can keep just sticking to the. Well, I mean, we may formally stick with the status quo. For instance, like I think we should keep strategic ambiguity formally, but actually understand that we would come to Taiwan's defense. I don't favor Taiwan independence. I would not go as far as Paul to reassure the Chinese that, I mean, I don't think we have an interest in that. I don't think but that's an ambiguity where there's clearly been a different understanding from on Beijing side and Washington side for many decades. And that was fine when the Chinese couldn't do anything about it. Now they potentially can. So having some sort of clearer understanding of how to deal with that, and Paul knows much more about that than I do, I think is important. And I agree that they need there needs to be something for them and something for their dignity. And I'm not, I don't agree with Jessica Chen Weiss for sure, but like, the very factors that I'm describing, a rising power feeling its oats, the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation, they demand recognition in a sort of Hegelian sense. So like we have to have that as part of the mix. What that exactly is, consistent with our interests, is going to be a difficult problem. But I think I agree it's something we need to confront.
So we have a very complex response from Paul Triolo, Senior VP for China at Albright Stonebridge Group, who writes, having just spent some time in Taiwan, I am struck by the extent to which there is little support on the island for mobilizing for conflict with China. There's a clear desire not to move in this direction, in part to avoid people deciding to leave Taiwan and to maintain a vibrant business climate, particularly in the tech sector, where maintaining confidence is critical. So I don't see any chance that arming Taiwan is an effective approach to deterrence. Given this, shouldn't there be a much more robust effort to rethink the trilateral relationship, ramp up diplomacy, and tone down the rhetoric around mobilizing both Taiwan and its allies to prepare for conflict? The stakes are high here. Bridge?
No, I mean, the fact that the Taiwanese are not adequately motivated is a huge problem, perhaps the biggest problem, but it doesn't change anything. So bear with me. I have this metaphor that I think works, that I've tried out in the Taiwanese. They don't necessarily love it, but I was in the last spring break, I was in the water with my wife, and the lifeguard called us in. He said a shark was right by you and you didn't see it, but you're lucky. So to me, lifeguards higher up, you can see the United States is like a person in a boat. Okay, it sounds somewhat patronizing, but I don't think it actually is. Is it like in a boat? We have the world's best intelligence gathering architecture. We're not always right, obviously, but it's unparalleled. We can see far more than anybody else. The Taiwanese are like a man in the water with a cut. Now they sort of have this. The Americans are shouting at them that there's a shark in the water, but they're closer to the shark, so they have a certain kind of finger feel for it, like the Taiwanese do with China, but they don't see exactly like how big the shark is and how it's going. And the problem is the Taiwanese, in a way, a person in the water with a shark, who's saying, "Hey, swim to the boat. I'm going to help you out." You're kind of paralyzed with fear, in a sense. And there's these different dynamics. I think there's fear. I think there's a sense of futility. I mean, on the other hand, Tsai Ing-wen's government has increased defense spending, too little, and they're not implementing the overall defense concept. The real problem, though, is that the Taiwanese, it's critical for their defense, both morally, but also just in a military sense. If the United States has to carry too much of the weight, they're going to fall. But the thing is, like, to the question, I mean, China's going to look at this. The Taiwanese also have no interest in becoming part of China. So there's an incompatible problem, right? The Taiwanese are not going to fall into their lap. It's not going to happen, right? I mean, even the KMT has moved away from one country, two systems. And meantime, they're militarily weak and irresolute. That's actually a really great opportunity for military aggression, because you actually could make it work, unlike in the case of Ukraine. That's the real danger. And what I tell the Taiwanese directly, I mean, the Chinese are talking about re-education camps. I'm sorry, like openly talking about re-education camps. So imagine what they really, I mean, look at how they shut down the COVID protests in like, no problem. People are talking about change of regime. Forget it. They're going to crush an insurgency on Taiwan in like weeks. So the Taiwanese are in real danger. And I don't think the American people are fully bought in to defending Taiwan. That's the dangerous thing. I think it's important that they do for their own interests, for our own interests, but they're not going to do it. So the situation, and this is why I'm not sanguine, to Paul's point, because if I just think about it, if I were sitting in Beijing, thinking about it from the kind of perspective I take for the US, I would say, that looks pretty good. And by the way, if we wait around, the Americans are going to have 100 B-21s in a few years. They're going to finally start pumping out submarines along with the Australians. I might lose the window. And that is a really, really bad situation.
Paul, could you give us a brief response as well?
Well, I think that applies to the extent that China is looking for an opportunity to use force. And as I said, I don't think they are. I mean, I'm still trying to figure out, how I would interpret your metaphor, Bridge. There's different ways to look at it.
I didn't go into the full thing. I'll tell you offline.
Yeah. No, I've heard it from you before, and I'm still grappling with it. But I mean, I think this all makes sense as far as the military equation is concerned. But my bottom line is that Taiwan is fundamentally not a military problem that lends itself to a military solution. I mean, as I said before, I agree with all of the deterrent elements of our policy and with regard to bolstering Taiwan's self-defense capabilities. But I think the problem here is a diplomatic and political one that needs to be confronted. And that's the way to avert escalation to military conflict. And to reiterate, I guess, to invoke something I said earlier, I think part of the problem with it, to the extent that we approach this as a military problem, and I take Bridges' point that he's not an advocate for, what's been announced as strategic clarity. But I think in your book and some of the things you've written, Bridge, you essentially create the logic to support the logic for U.S. support for permanent separation. And I think that flows from the determination that you and others have made about the strategic importance of Taiwan. My concern is that U.S. support for permanent separation, de facto or otherwise, and U.S. support for strategic clarity are both inconsistent with our one China commitments, because they would both constitute a restoration of a defense pact with Taiwan, which was the primary requirement for the normalization process. And again, I agree with Bridge that there's a lot of, things that are wrong with that scaffolding 40 years later. But I think we need to confront those fault lines rather than continue to approach this as primarily a military challenge and a problem for military deterrence.
Let me just address this, because I think this is kind of where it gets the nub. I mean, look, there's the logic of things, and then there's diplomatic fictions and political fictions that can be useful. I agree that we need to confront it and think clearly. So for instance, I'm in favor of capital A, strategic ambiguity, if you will, SA, but I'm in favor of small letter strategic clarity, right? Like that's speaking out of both sides of our mouth, but like, that's life in the big city. And on permanent separation, I don't think we need to take, I mean, that's the kind of thing where I don't think we need to have a clear policy. I don't think our one China, I mean, you know better than I do, but I don't think in our one China policy, I mean, our position has been that we don't take a position on the territorial disposition of Taiwan. I also don't know what Kissinger said in Beijing, and I think honestly his record is going to look worse and worse as time goes on, frankly. Bob Blackwell's going to attack me for saying that, but I mean, and we may have to reassess. Now, we have to reassess very carefully, not because it's immoral, but because the Chinese are going to get very angry about that. But I think we need, and that's something we need to be realistic about. But I think it would be a big disaster for us if Taiwan were to fall. But that's sort of, I mean, well, it's the old Deng Xiaoping line that this will be solved by future generations. If we could get to that, and maybe there's kind of Commonwealth models over time that we could explore to kind of kick the can down the road. We don't need to come to a clean political solution in the near term. I think we need to have, but I think in our heads, the Chinese can't be allowed to seize Taiwan, but we also should not poke the dragon in the eye, just for prudence, if nothing else.
I think we'll end with a question from Ravi Velour, who is a columnist at the Straits Times. And asks, he thinks U.S. resolve appears to have stiffened in the past year, and asks, is it time to aggregate U.S. power with that of Japan, Australia, and India when it comes to the Indo-Pacific? And then asks the question, which intrigues me as well, has China's power in fact peaked? Paul?
Well, those are two very different questions. I mean, the first question is how we can operationalize the Quad, essentially, I think.
Correct. And does that signify, if we do, and does that signify that in fact China's power has peaked? They're not going to be the colossal threat in the future.
Well, let me try to address the first question first. I think there are some problems with the operational potential of the Quad, and I think it gets to, in part, there are a range of views both within the Quad and across our broader alliance network in East Asia as to how confrontational we should be towards China. I think there are actually a range of views as to what the extent and the nature of the China threat is, whether it's more economic or military. So I think that I wouldn't put all my eggs in the Quad basket, because I think there's some flaws about how collectively we could operate, against the Chinese. Well, and in fact, I think that there's some concern about there's apprehension across the Quad and across the alliance network as to whether a containment alliance is the way to go. I think that, and I support the idea that we should be contemplating a policy in the region which is not entirely exclusive of and targeted at China. I think there's a big hole in the middle of that approach, because China needs to be part of multilateralism in the region, and I think that's our primary challenge. As to whether China has peaked or not, that strikes me as an academic question. I don't know that they've peaked. I think that my guess is that the answer is no. But even if the Chinese had peaked, there's still going to be a consequential challenge for us that's going to beg attention, and this requirement that we come up with some way of pursuing a relationship with them through our alliances as well.
Bridge?
It's an inadequate answer, but
well,
I can give you a more articulate one.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Bridge?
I think I think of it as an anti-hegemonic coalition, so I think it is defined anti-China, although it's not China per se, it's more the aspiring regional hegemon, so it's structural. I think that is coming together, and that's encouraging. I don't think we can neatly aggregate, and I go into this a lot in my book if you're interested, but we can't neatly aggregate all of our US partners and allies and just say that matches against China, because what matters in a sense is what I'm saying fundamentally in these geopolitical competitions is really military power, and military power is defined by distance in a lot of ways. I mean, India can't project military power to India, so India's military is irrelevant to the Taiwan military balance, which is, deductively, my argument is that China would pursue a focused and sequential strategy. It would not seek to fight everybody at the same time. It's more like divide and conquer. So we should, and this is the fundamental fallacy with the argument that the administration and others often make, that we have this unparalleled alliance system. True, much of that is latent. I mean, countries like Germany and until recently Japan have not been spending very much, and also their militaries are not relevant to the scenarios that we're actually thinking about. So such an unwieldy kind of massive alliance can be defeated in detail, basically. So I think that's the way we need to think about things. And also military victory, and we see this in Ukraine, success or failure can have political ramifications. A lot of countries allied with Germany when they saw what way the wind was blowing in 1940, 41, et cetera. To your second question, has China peaked? So I'm not an economist. I mean, I don't think anybody knows. I'd say a couple of things. One, from a strategic point of view, we don't know the future, so we should prepare for the downside. The worst outcome would be if we underprepare and China does continue growing and become stronger and dominates Asia, et cetera. Conversely, if we overprepare and China falls down, we will have spent some extra money and taken some risk here and there, but that's a lot less bad. So from a strategic point of view, I just think I don't think it's that complicated, because we should prepare for the downside. Moreover, US-China trades at its highest levels. People are, Volkswagen, Wall Street are funneling money into China. one point, I mean, I'm sure everybody on here has spent time in China. I mean, I grew up off and on in Hong Kong and so forth. I mean, the Chinese have kind of like cracked into modernity in the economic sense. They are likely to continue growing at some level, even as there's demographic decline. So I think it's prudent to assume that China will continue to grow, even if it's not at 7%. By the way, they may go through massive corrections. I mean, the United States, as it grew in the 19th century, had huge depressions and recessions. So I don't think that now they could end up like Japan, but Japan, I think, is like 2/3, 3/4 the per capita GDP of the United States. If China ended up like that, it would be 2x the American economy or more. So I think that's not a very reassuring outcome itself.
Final question for you guys, which you can answer easily and simply, I think. Is Biden doing a good job? Bridge?
No, not on the fundamental issue.
Okay, Paul?
It depends on the category and how we define fundamental issues. My bottom line is that the alternative was Trump. So I'm fine. I mean, I've got some complaints against Biden, including on China policy, but that's a separate conversation.
Well, a no and a qualified yes on Biden and Asia. Thank you, gentlemen. I really appreciate your taking the time. I hope our viewers enjoyed it as much as I did. And it will also be on YouTube and the TNI website if you are moved to recommend it to one of your friends or even watch it again yourself. Thank you. And that concludes our session.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.